Once upon a time, in 2014, a Minecraft forum user made up a fake creepypasta. They called it Entity 303. The story was simple. A disgruntled ex-Mohang employee, fired for hacking the game, returned as a ghost in the code. Their mission: to corrupt your world, slowly, very slowly, by replacing random blocks with cobwebs or maybe a misplaced sign. But here's the truth. Entity 303 was never real. Just a blurry screenshot of a player in a white skin and a very bored imagination. People claimed they saw Entity 303 in single-player worlds. The proof: a log that said error, null entity, which just meant their game crashed. Sometimes a snow biome would generate weirdly, and players would whisper, 303 did this. No, it was just Mojang's buggy terrain code. Like always, the most chilling image of Entity 303 was a player standing still in a white suit. That's it. No glowing eyes, no bloody textures, just Steve in a lab coat. Some said if you stared at the image too long, you'd hear Herobrine sigh from 2010. Annoyed at being upstaged, rumors spread that Entity 303 was a virus hiding in mods. The truth: the only virus was bad adware from Minecraft hack sites. If your world corrupted, it wasn't 303, it was your little brother deleting files, or Java being Java. Players shared cursed seeds. Where Entity 303 appeared, one had a floating village, which was just a terrain bug. Another had a mineshaft with no chests. Horror. The real curse: wasting an hour waiting for nothing to happen. Some claimed Entity 303 played distorted noises, but Minecraft's sound engine has always glitched. That whispering, a cave ambient track looped wrong. The laughing, a zombie suffocating in a wall. In 2015, a modder made an Entity 303 mod where a white figure walked around and did nothing. The scariest part: it cost $5 on a sketchy website and didn't even work on Forge. By 2016, Entity 303 faded away. No dramatic ending, no secret update, just forgotten. Like Herobrine and the Mohang ghost girl. And that one guy who swore Notch hit a demon in the nether. In 2011, Minecraft was full of mysteries. Back then, no one knew how deep caves went or what the far lands were. Entity 303 was just another shadow for kids to fear. Now, we have the Warden, and it's actually scary. Well, sometimes. So, was Entity 303 real? No. Was it a fun story? Not really. Did you fall asleep yet? Good night. Of course. People kept seeing Entity 303 for years after the myth died. Funny thing, every single sighting had a perfectly boring explanation. That figure in the distance, a snow golem, the glitching textures, a graphics card overheating, the disappearing items. Just a hopper system you forgot about. The real horror wasn't Entity 303, it was realizing you'd spent 3 hours staring at a chunk error, waiting for something, anything, to happen. After Entity 303 came the imitators, null entity, the redstone observer, the 404 glitch, all equally underwhelming. One story claimed a ghost villager would trade you death messages. Another said a secret mob hid in jungle temples. But no one checked jungle temples anyway. The creepypasta well was running dry. Just like your motivation to finish that mega build. In 2017, a speedrunner attempted to summon Entity 303 by corrupting their world file midrun. The result: a 12-hour livestream of them reinstalling Java. The chat kept asking, is it here yet? The answer: no. Just like your dad coming back with those nether portal materials he promised. At least 47 YouTube channels uploaded I found Entity 303 in real life gone wrong videos. The proof, always the same, a white skin standing still. A corrupted texture, or just a straight-up Herobrine mod with the serial numbers filed off. The only thing scary was the ad revenue, and the realization that this was someone's career. In 2018, a modder released Entity 303 Reborn, a scary mod where the entity followed you slowly at a speed of 0.5 blocks per second. Players reported falling asleep before it reached them. The only terror was realizing you'd wasted $3 on Patreon for this on a dusty Minecraft forum thread from 2014. Someone still bumps the post every year. Guys, I think 303 is in my world. The replies, post screenshots, they never do. The thread lingers, like a zombie in sunlight. Not burning, not alive, just, they're dead. In 2020, a YouTuber claimed to find lost footage of Entity 303 from Notch's secret hard drive. The video. Just 10 minutes of a corrupted super flat world, with a single dirt block missing. The description read, scariest thing I've ever seen. The comments read, I've seen scarier things in my item solder. The whole fired for hacking backstory. Made up, Mojang's actual ex-employees were too busy making actual games. The real horror? Realizing the person who wrote the creepypasta was probably a 14-year-old. Procrastinating on their math homework, nostalgia, not for Entity 303, but for when Minecraft felt infinite, when a white skin in a screenshot could make your heart race. Before you learned what a reskin was. Now we data mine updates. We know how the sausage is made, and the sausage is just pork and salt. So does Entity 303 matter? No. Was it creative? Not really. Did it inspire anything? A few bad mods and a t-shirt on Redbubble, but for one brief, boring moment, it gave us something to argue about. Instead of finishing that automatic farm will never complete, every few years, someone tries to bring Entity 303 back. A new Reddit post surfaces with blurry screenshots. A YouTube video claims fresh evidence, but the magic is gone. The comments fill with people saying they remember when this was scary. Now it's just another dead meme in Minecraft's graveyard of forgotten lore. Content creators tried turning it into a challenge. Survive 100 days while being hunted by Entity 303. The problem? Nothing happens. They just play normal Minecraft while pretending to be nervous. After 7 episodes of nothing, the series gets quietly deleted. Somewhere out there, a shady print-on-demand store still sells Entity 303 t-shirts. The design is just a poorly rendered white figure with red eyes. The product description promises mystery and terror. The reviews say the shirt arrived with the wrong color and shrank in the wash. Someone created an Entity 303% speedrun category where players had to trigger specific glitches. It was abandoned when runners realized the glitches were just normal world generation quirks. The record stands at infinity because nobody finished a valid run. A small group tried to turn Entity 303 into an alternate reality game. They left cryptic messages in old forum threads and created fake Twitter accounts. After 3 weeks of nobody caring, they gave up and moved on to SCP fanfiction instead, when someone claimed Entity 303 appeared in Minecraft Education Edition. Teachers had to explain to students why their worlds weren't actually haunted. The real horror was children learning about computer bugs instead of supernatural ones. A modder packaged 20 different horror mods together and called it the Tru Entity 303 experience. It crashed on startup for 90% of users. The other 10% reported their games ran slightly slower, which they interpreted as presence. For years, editors fought over whether Entity 303 deserved a page on the official Minecraft wiki. The compromise was a single paragraph under community creations that gets vandalized every October. Somewhere right now, a single person is making a video about Entity 303. They've spent hours editing spooky sound effects over footage of a corrupted chunk. When they upload it, 3 people will watch. 1 will comment fake. The creator will reply, "You just don't understand. Minecraft isn't scary. because of made-up entities. It's scary when you're deep underground with low torches and hear lava. When your diamond pickaxe is at 1 durability. When you've been playing for 6 hours and realize you forgot to eat. Entity 303 was never in the code. The real terror was the friends we lost along the way to uncompleted builds. Entity 303 remains a footnote in Minecraft history. A relic of simpler times when a white skin could spark imagination. Now we have actual threats like phantoms and wardens. Progress marches on, the legend fades. The game continues. As the world loads one last time, we reflect on Entity 303, not as a horror story, but as a reminder of how easily we create myths. How a community can will something into existence through sheer boredom. The figure was never real. The fear was never genuine. But for a brief moment, it gave us something to talk about besides mining fatigue. The screen fades, the music slows, the story ends exactly as it began. With absolutely nothing happening, academic researchers occasionally stumble upon the Entity 303 phenomenon while studying internet folklore. They write lengthy papers analyzing how a simple creepypasta managed to embed itself so deeply into Minecraft culture despite having no basis in reality. The studies conclude that Entity 303 represents the human tendency to anthropomorphize glitches and seek patterns in randomness. Graduate students debate whether this says more about gaming communities or psychological archetypes, all while their own Minecraft worlds sit abandoned mid-project. After years of debate, speedrunners officially classified Entity 303 as a non-mechanic, something that cannot affect runs in any way. The ruling came after hundreds of hours of testing where players deliberately corrupted world files, manipulated RNG, and even tried summoning rituals involving nether portals at specific coordinates. The only result was decreased frame rates and several corrupted save files. The speedrun community moved on to more pressing matters, like optimizing bastion routes and debating whether certain glitches constituted cheating. A major gaming merchandise company once considered an official Entity 303 Plus. Market research showed moderate interest, but the legal department vetoed it when they realized they'd be licensing a fan creation based on nothing. Instead, they released a Warden plush that actually made money. The prototype Entity 303 plush now sits in a warehouse somewhere, its blank white fabric slowly yellowing with age. Waiting for a Halloween sale that will never come, one ambitious modder attempted to create the definitive Entity 303 experience, complete with custom sound effects, world corruption mechanics, and a backstory involving ancient builders. The mod was so unstable it corrupted biomes 3 chunks away from where the entity appeared. Players reported their entire worlds becoming unplayable after encounters. The modder disappeared from forums shortly after release, leaving behind a trail of corrupted worlds and a single cryptic post about the code taking on a life of its own. Child psychologists reported cases of younger Minecraft players developing genuine anxiety about Entity 303, despite it being entirely fictional. Parents found children refusing to play alone or compulsively backing up their worlds. The phenomenon mirrored earlier moral panics about video game violence, except instead of concern about aggression, it was about pixelated ghosts that didn't actually exist. Therapists developed techniques to help children distinguish between game fiction and reality, often using the very Minecraft creative mode that started the fears. When Mojang updated their community guidelines, hundreds of old Entity 303 threads disappeared overnight. Moderators deemed them low quality content or fearmongering. The deletion sparked brief outrage among lore enthusiasts who argued this was erasing Minecraft history. The controversy lasted approximately 3 days before everyone moved on to arguing about the next update's mob vote. A few archived threads remain, buried deep in internet archives, waiting for some future historian to rediscover this peculiar footnote in gaming culture. Anthropologists began comparing Entity 303 to other digital folklore like Slender Man or Herobrine. They noted how these entities all shared characteristics, pale faces, ties to technology, and ambiguous origins. Papers were written about how modern mythology evolves in digital spaces. Entire conference panels debated whether these were genuine folklore or just elaborate memes. Meanwhile, actual Minecraft players continued building automatic farms, completely unaware of these academic discussions happening in parallel to their gameplay. During a particularly dry content period, a gaming news site tried to revive interest in Entity 303 with a 10 years later retrospective. The article framed it as a nostalgic look back at early Minecraft culture. Readers pointed out that the timeline was wrong. Entity 303 emerged years after Minecraft's peak. The comments section devolved into arguments about when exactly Minecraft jumped the shark, with opinions ranging from after the Microsoft acquisition to when they added parrots. The article was quietly edited to remove the timeline claims, but kept the nostalgic tone. A small team of filmmakers attempted to document the Entity 303 phenomenon. They interviewed forum posters, mod creators, and even reached out to Mojang for comment. The project stalled when they realized there was no actual story, just a series of people making things up and others believing them. The raw footage sits on a hard drive somewhere. Hours of interviews with teenagers saying some variation of "I thought it was cool at the time." Occasionally, the director considers finishing it as a meditation on collective delusion rather than a gaming documentary years later. A prominent speedrunner admitted to faking an Entity 303 encounter during a charity stream. The glitch was just a texture pack they'd made and quickly switched to. They'd expected it to be obvious, but chat immediately erupted with theories about corrupted chunks and secret updates. The confession sparked minor outrage from those who'd cited the clip as evidence, but most of the community just shrugged. By this point, Minecraft had actual scary mods that didn't require imagination to find frightening. When a video game museum planned an exhibit on Minecraft culture, early drafts included a section on Entity 303. Curators debated whether to display fan art, corrupted world files, or interview excerpts. The section was ultimately cut for being too niche compared to exhibits on redstone engineering or build techniques. The only remnant was a single placard mentioning community-created myths in a section about player creativity. Visitors walked past it without stopping on their way to see the life-sized creeper sculpture years after the myth's death. A gaming news site published Entity 303 confirmed in latest update. The article cited vague patch notes about fixed entity rendering issues as proof. Readers immediately called out the transparent attempt to revive a dead meme. The article was quietly updated to focus on actual update features, but not before being screenshotted and mocked across social media. It became a case study in how gaming journalism struggles to find new angles on old stories. Entity 303 faded from memory not with controversy or debunking, but through simple neglect. New players joined Minecraft unaware of the myth. Old players forgot they'd ever been scared by it. The forum posts stopped being bumped. The YouTube videos stopped getting recommended. The myth became just another piece of digital detritus floating in the vast ocean of internet culture, occasionally washing up when someone searched scary Minecraft myths and sorted by oldest. Ironically, Entity 303's influence appeared where least expected, in actual game development. Designers cited it as an example of how player imagination could create experiences beyond what was programmed. Some horror games deliberately included glitch effects inspired by the myth. A few indie developers even credited Entity 303 as inspiration for their narrative design, though none could explain exactly how a non-existent Minecraft ghost influenced their psychological thriller about office workers. Digital historians began classifying Entity 303 as part of a specific era of internet culture, post-Slender Man but pre-Among Us, when collaborative storytelling mixed with gaming communities. They noted how these myths flourished in sandbox games where players could project their own narratives onto blank slates. Entire theses were written about how Minecraft's very openness made it fertile ground for such legends, with Entity 303 being just one of many that came and went without leaving any actual mark on the game's code. Folklorists drew connections between Entity 303 and traditional ghost stories. The One employee narrative mirrored tales of factory ghosts and mine spirits. The digital nature updated these archetypes for the internet age, replacing haunted factories with corrupted save files. Scholars debated whether this represented continuity in human storytelling or just our tendency to recycle the same plots with new trappings. Meanwhile, actual Minecraft players continued mining, building, and occasionally jumping at perfectly normal cave sounds. Entity 303 mattered not because it was scary, but because it represented a moment when Minecraft's community collectively decided to pretend something was real. In an age of data mining and instant debunking, that brief period of willing suspension of disbelief became increasingly rare. The myth's power came not from any actual in-game manifestation, but from the shared experience of wondering what if, before the inevitable return to reality. As long as Minecraft exists, someone will rediscover Entity 303. A new player will stumble upon an old forum thread. A content creator will make a scary Minecraft myths video. The cycle will begin again, if only briefly. Because ultimately, Entity 303 was never about the code or the game. It was about the human need for mystery in a world where everything can be explained with a wiki search. And that need, unlike the myth itself, shows no signs of disappearing. The story of Entity 303 transcends mere gaming folklore. It represents a fascinating case study in how digital communities collectively construct mythology. Anthropologists specializing in internet cultures have noted how Entity 303 perfectly encapsulates the three-phase life cycle of modern digital legends: emergence through ambiguous forum posts, propagation via YouTube videos and image macros, and institutionalization through wiki articles and attempted merchandising. What makes Entity 303 particularly noteworthy is how it emerged during Minecraft's transitional period between indie darling and Microsoft property, representing a last gasp of player-driven mystery before the game became thoroughly data-mined and corporatized. Detailed analysis of early forum threads shows how the legend evolved through a process of collaborative storytelling, with each retelling adding new details like the supposed ex-employee backstory or specific corruption effects. This mirrors traditional oral folklore's mutation over time, but compressed into weeks rather than generations. The myth's staying power, despite being thoroughly debunked, speaks to powerful psychological factors: the human brain's pattern recognition tendencies, our attraction to secret knowledge, and the comforting idea that even in meticulously coded digital worlds, there might still be room for the unexplained. From a game development perspective, Entity 303 was always impossible, and understanding why provides insight into Minecraft's architecture. Minecraft's entity system simply doesn't allow for the kind of behavior described in the creepypasta. Entities, whether mobs, items, or particles, are all defined in the code with specific parameters and spawn conditions. A rogue entity corrupting worlds would require either a fundamental engine flaw, which would have been caught during Mojang's rigorous testing, or deliberate malicious code, which would constitute actual hacking. The glitches attributed to Entity 303 disappearing blocks, strange sounds, world corruption all have mundane explanations rooted in Java's memory management or graphics card limitations. Even the famous white figure sightings can be explained through known rendering bugs where players' skins fail to load properly. Modders who attempted to create Entity 303 mods found they had to deliberately program every supposed supernatural behavior, proving the game wouldn't spontaneously generate such phenomena. The myth's persistence despite these technical realities demonstrates how little the average player understands about game development, and how easily coincidental bugs can be misinterpreted as intentional design. This knowledge gap between creators and consumers fuels many gaming urban legends, with Entity 303 being a particularly enduring example. Entity 303 raises profound questions about the nature of belief in digital spaces. Why did thousands of players, many fully aware it was fictional, choose to suspend disbelief? The answer lies in how Minecraft blurs the line between game and world. When players spend hundreds of hours in a persistent, editable environment, they begin relating to it psychologically as a place rather than just software. This mental shift makes them more susceptible to attributing agency to glitches, what psychologists call patternicity, seeing meaningful patterns in random noise. Entity 303 also represents a modern manifestation of the machine spirit concept, the anthropomorphizing of technology that dates back to ancient sailors believing ships had souls. In Minecraft's case, players projected human motivations onto the game's occasional misbehavior. The MIPS timing is also significant. It emerged as Minecraft was transitioning from novelty to institution, when veteran players felt nostalgic for the game's earlier, less explained days. Entity 303 became a vessel for that longing, a way to pretend the game still held mysteries before every biome and mob was cataloged on Wikis. This phenomenon isn't unique to Minecraft. Similar myths appear in other persistent worlds like World of Warcraft or Second Life, but Minecraft's sandbox nature made it particularly fertile ground. Ultimately, Entity 303 says less about the game than about human nature, our eternal desire for wonder, even in spaces we've built ourselves. Entity 303 didn't emerge in isolation. It's part of a rich tradition of gaming urban legends that reveal fascinating patterns about player psychology. Comparing it to similar myths like Herobrine, Minecraft's first ghost, the Lavender Town Syndrome Pokémon, or Polybius, the arcade game that never existed, shows consistent themes across gaming folklore. These legends almost always involve 1. A humanoid figure where none should exist, 2. Supposed harmful effects on either the game or player, and 3. Vague connections to real-world tragedies or corporate secrets. Entity 303 checks all these boxes with its ex-employee backstory and world corruption claims. What sets Entity 303 apart is its timing. It emerged when internet culture had become more sophisticated about hoaxes, yet still spread rapidly. This suggests that our appetite for such myths hasn't diminished, only evolved. The legend also reflects Minecraft's unique position as both a game and creative platform. Players wanted to believe in hidden depths beyond the sandbox tools they'd mastered. Interestingly, while most gaming myths fade after debunking, Entity 303 enjoyed periodic resurgences whenever Minecraft updates introduced new glitches that players could misinterpret. This cyclical nature mirrors how traditional folklore adapts to new contexts while retaining core elements. The comparison also highlights how gaming legends have become more democratic, where Polybium required arcade cabinets and Herobrine relied on single-player worlds. Entity 303 flourished across forums, YouTube, and multiplayer servers, showing how gaming folklore has adapted to connected digital ecosystems. Understanding why Entity 303 emerged when it did requires examining Minecraft's socioeconomic landscape in 2014. The game was transitioning from indie phenomenon to Microsoft property acquired for $2.5 billion that September, creating anxiety among veteran players about commercialization. The disgruntled ex-employee narrative tapped directly into these fears, a literal ghost of Minecraft's past haunting its corporate future. This period also saw growing tensions between Minecraft's original survival mode purists and the rising creative, social players, with Entity 303 serving as a folkloric representation of the old ways striking back. The myth spread coincided with Minecraft's explosive growth on YouTube, where creators needed ever more dramatic content to stand out. Entity 303 provided perfect fodder, easy to fake, impossible to definitively disprove, and guaranteed to engage younger viewers. Economically, the legend emerged when Minecraft merchandise was becoming big business, creating financial incentives to keep myths alive. Even Mojang eventually capitalized on Herobrine with official merch. The timing also relates to gaming hardware. 2014 saw widespread adoption of shaders and texture packs that could make ordinary glitches look supernatural, while still limited RAM in home computers made world corruption believable. On a broader cultural level, Entity 303 reflected growing societal unease about technology's opacity. As software became more complex, average players understood less about how games actually worked, making them more susceptible to myths about hidden code and rogue processes. This perfect storm of factors explains why this particular legend gained traction when it did, and why similar myths in earlier or later periods failed to achieve the same cultural penetration. Neuroscience helps explain why otherwise rational players believed or wanted to believe in Entity 303. The human brain is wired to detect agency, a survival mechanism that makes us see faces in clouds and spirits in rustling grass. This hyperactive agency detection goes into overdrive in games like Minecraft, where the environment responds to play actions. We start attributing intention to random glitches. Functional MRI studies show that when players encounter unexpected game events, the same brain regions light up as when detecting potential threats in nature. Entity 303 narratives exploit this by providing a satisfying explanation, a malicious entity for mundane occurrences, bugs. The myth also taps into apophenia, seeing connections between unrelated things as players string together coincidental glitches into a perceived pattern of haunting. Cognitive dissonance then reinforces the belief after investing time in investigating. Players feel compelled to justify their efforts by finding evidence. The legend's persistence is further aided by confirmation bias, where believers remember hits that one weird glitch while ignoring misses thousands of normal gameplay hours. Even knowing Entity 303 is fake, many players experience algorithmic anxiety, the unease that complex systems might develop unpredictable behaviors beyond their programming. This explains why technical debunkings rarely kill such myths. They address the rational brain while ignoring the emotional circuits that find comfort in anthropomorphized explanations. Minecraft's sandbox nature exacerbates this by giving players godlike control. Entity 303 represents the subconscious fear that something might be controlling them back. Entity 303's spread raises important questions about responsibility in gaming communities, and like traditional urban legends, digital myths can have real-world consequences. Children experiencing sleep disturbances, players deleting cherished worlds unnecessarily, or harassment of developers accused of hiding secrets. The myth's propagation involved ethically gray areas, YouTubers faking encounters for views, modders creating virus-like mods that actually corrupted worlds, and forum users bullying skeptics. These behaviors exist in a legal gray zone while protected as creative expression. They sometimes veered into fraud or digital vandalism. The situation becomes murkier considering Minecraft's young player base. At what point does playful myth-making become exploitation? Mojang's quiet tolerance of such myths compared to their swift debunking of Herobrine suggests corporations now recognize the marketing value of community-driven mysteries, even at the cost of occasional player distress. Entity 303 also presaged modern concerns about fake news. Its spread mechanisms, ambiguous screenshots, unverifiable anecdotes mirror how misinformation propagates in broader digital culture. Legal scholars note how gaming myths test the boundaries of liability when a player's corrupted world results from an Entity 303 mod rather than the supposed ghost. Who bears responsibility? These questions remain unresolved as new legends continue emerging across gaming platforms, with Entity 303 serving as an important case study in balancing creative freedom against potential harm in virtual communities. Entity 303 may represent one of the last great gaming urban legends before complete transparency made such myths untenable. Today's games are too thoroughly data-mined, live-streamed, and reverse-engineered to sustain mysteries for long. The rise of AI-generated content further complicates matters. Future legends might be instantly debunked as procedurally generated fakes. Yet Entity 303's legacy suggests our appetite for digital folklore will persist. Adapting to new technological realities, already we see myths forming around AI behavior in games, glitches reinterpreted as emergent intelligence. Minecraft itself continues spawning new legends like the recent Warden hive mind theories, though none have achieved Entity 303's cultural penetration. The myth's endurance offers lessons for game designers. Players crave discoverable secrets and unexplained phenomena, even in meticulously documented games. Some studios now deliberately plant Easter eggs that mimic classic glitches to satisfy this desire. Entity 303 also foreshadowed how gaming communities would become primary myth-making spaces, with platforms like Discord allowing legends to spread and mutate at unprecedented speeds. as virtual worlds grow more complex and immersive. The line between intended design and player imagination will blur further. Future Entity 303s may emerge from misinterpreted procedural generation or AI behaviors rather than simple bugs, regardless of form. These legends will continue serving the same fundamental human needs for mystery in a knowable world, for storytelling in digital spaces, and for communal bonding over shared imagined experiences. In this sense, Entity 303 wasn't an endpoint, but a prototype for how mythology will evolve in increasingly digital cultures. Entity 303's most fascinating aspect may be what it reveals about contemporary spirituality in digital spaces. The willingness to believe in or at least entertain a ghost in the machine reflects deeper existential questions about consciousness in virtual worlds. Philosophers of technology note how Entity 303 narratives mirror ancient animistic beliefs, with players attributing spirit to digital processes. This digital animism becomes more pronounced as we spend increasing time in virtual spaces. When a world feels alive enough to create and destroy, it becomes psychologically plausible that it might harbor unseen agents. The myth also touches on transhumanist themes, the idea that a human consciousness could transition into code, as the ex-employee backstory suggests. Theological scholars observe how Entity 303 fulfills the same role as demons in medieval cosmology, an explanation for inexplicable malfunctions and corruptions. The legend's timing is noteworthy. It emerged as society was beginning to seriously debate AI rights and digital consciousness, suggesting our folklore is evolving alongside our technology. Even players who rationally knew Entity 303 was fake reported eerie feelings when encountering similar glitches, demonstrating how virtual experiences can trigger primal superstitions. This persistence of magical thinking in digital natives challenges assumptions about secularization. It seems we haven't stopped believing in the supernatural so much as relocated its dwelling place from forests to servers. Entity 303, then, becomes more than a gaming myth. It's a cultural artifact documenting how humanity is adapting spirituality for the digital age, finding gods and ghosts in the gaps of our understanding of increasingly complex systems. The final paradox of Entity 303 is how this completely fabricated myth generated tangible, lasting impacts on Minecraft's development and community. The legend indirectly influenced Mojang's approach to horror elements. The Phantom's insomnia mechanic and Warden's sound-based detection show developers learning how to create genuine scares that don't rely on community myth-making. Modding tools improved partially in response to Entity 303 mod's instability, leading to more robust error handling. The myth spread prompted Mojang to implement better crash reporting, reducing instances of ambiguous errors that fueled speculation. On the community side, Entity 303 became a rite of passage. Older players would introduce newcomers to the legend as part of Minecraft's oral history, regardless of its veracity. The myth also inspired actual in-game creations, haunted maps, redstone contraptions that simulated corruption, and adventure modes with Entity 303 themes. YouTube's Minecraft ecosystem owes part of its growth to Entity 303 content, with early horror creators cutting their teeth on these videos before moving to original concepts. Educationally, the phenomenon became a case study in media literacy. Teachers used Entity 303 to demonstrate how misinformation spreads online. Most ironically, the myth's debunking led to greater appreciation for Minecraft's actual glitches as charming quirks rather than supernatural occurrences. In the end, Entity 303's greatest trick wasn't haunting worlds, it was haunting culture, transforming from a simple creepypasta into a lens through which we examine player psychology, community dynamics, and the evolving relationship between humans and the digital worlds we inhabit. Like all good myths, it told us less about monsters than about ourselves, our fears, our creativity, and our endless capacity for finding wonder. Even in the most meticulously coded of realities, Entity 303, despite its fictional nature, represents a convergence of deep psychological archetypes that have existed in human storytelling for millennia. The figure embodies the trickster archetype, a boundary crosser who disrupts the normal order of things, much like Loki in Norse mythology or Coyote in Native American folklore. In Minecraft's context, where players exert godlike control over their environment, Entity 303 served as the ultimate subversive force, an unpredictable element that could not be commanded or contained. Additionally, the myth taps into the shadow archetype described by Carl Jung, the repressed, darker aspects of the self that people project onto external figures. For Minecraft players, who often spend hours carefully constructing orderly worlds, Entity 303 represented the chaotic underbelly of their creations, the fear that all their hard work could be undone by forces beyond their control. This psychological underpinning explains why the myth resonated so powerfully, even among players who knew it wasn't real. The Xmohang employee backstory further reinforced this by adding a layer of corporate intrigue, the idea that even in a game celebrated for its openness and creativity, there might be hidden agendas and suppressed truths. Pareidolia, the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random stimuli, played a crucial role in Entity 303's propagation. Minecraft's blocky, low-resolution graphics made it particularly susceptible to this phenomenon. A floating piece of wool could become a ghostly figure at the right angle. A lighting glitch might resemble glowing eyes in the darkness. The game's very design, which relies on players' imaginations to fill in visual gaps, created fertile ground for misinterpretation. Neuroscientific studies suggest that pareidolia activates the same brain regions responsible for face recognition and threat detection. In Minecraft's often isolated environments, particularly at night or in deep caves, this biological hardwiring went into overdrive. Players would swear they glimpsed a white figure in the distance, only to realize it was a snow golem or a partially rendered chunk error. Yet the initial jolt of fear cemented the belief that something supernatural was afoot. This effect was amplified by Minecraft's sound design. Ambiguous noises like cave ambience or distant mob sounds provided the perfect auditory canvas for players to hear evidence of Entity 303's presence. Entity 303 belongs to a broader pantheon of digital deities and spirits that have emerged alongside computer culture. Like the machine elves of DMT folklore or the gremlins of early aviation myths, these entities serve as personifications of technological uncertainty. What makes Entity 303 unique is its procedural nature. It wasn't just a static image or story, but a dynamic legend that players believed could manifest differently in each world. This mirrors ancient nature spirits that were said to appear in various forms depending on location and circumstance. The myth also shares DNA with tulpa concepts in Tibetan Buddhism, entities willed into existence through collective belief. In Minecraft's case, the sheer number of players looking for Entity 303 created a kind of digital tulpa effect, where the boundary between imagined and real manifestations blurred in community discourse. The legend's staying power suggests that as human consciousness extends further into digital spaces, we're developing new mythologies that hybridize ancient archetypes with modern technology anxieties. The rapid spread of Entity 303 can't be understood without examining the economic incentives driving Minecraft content creation in the mid-2010s. As YouTube's algorithm began prioritizing watch time and engagement, creators discovered that horror content, especially ambiguous, unverifiable horror, kept viewers hooked. A typical Entity 303 video followed a proven formula. The hook: I wasn't going to post this, but what I found. It changes everything. The build-up: 10 minutes of normal gameplay with increasing glitches. The payoff: a blurry figure in the distance or corrupted world file. The cliffhanger: I'm going back in Smash, like and subscribe for part 2. This structure proved so effective that it spawned countless imitators, creating an entire microgenre of Minecraft horror. The economic reality was stark. A single successful Entity 303 video could garner millions of views, translating to substantial ad revenue. This created a feedback loop where the financial rewards incentivized more creators to produce Entity 303 content, which in turn exposed more players to the myth, making it appear more real through sheer ubiquity. Brain imaging studies reveal that encountering threats in virtual environments like Minecraft activates the amygdala, the brain's fear center, almost as strongly as real-world dangers. This explains why Entity 303 sightings, even when rationally known to be fake, could trigger genuine fight or flight responses. The effect was particularly pronounced in younger players, whose still developing prefrontal cortexes had more difficulty overriding instinctive fear reactions with logical analysis. Neuropsychologists identified 3 phases in the Entity 303 fear response: detection, the initial moment of perceiving a potential threat of movement in peripheral vision, and unexpected sound appraisal, the split. Second, assessment of whether the stimulus matches known threat patterns, Entity 303 descriptions, consolidation, the post-event memory formation, where the brain often enhances details to fit the expected narrative. This neurological process meant that each purported Entity 303 encounter actually rewired players' brains to be more sensitive to future signs, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of belief. The phenomenon wasn't limited to visual stimuli. Players reported hearing distinctive sounds that weren't actually present in the game files, demonstrating how expectation shapes perception at the neural level. Cultural anthropologists now recognize a repeating pattern in online communities that they term digital folklore cycles. Entity 303 represents a textbook example of this phenomenon's 4-phase structure. Emergence. A core idea appears in niche forums or image boards, the original 2014 posts. Elaboration. The community collaboratively adds details, backstory, behaviors, sightings. Institutionalization. The myth enters mainstream platforms: YouTube, Wikis, merchandise, archaeology. Later, users rediscover and reinterpret the myth as retro or nostalgic. What makes Entity 303 cycle noteworthy is its recurrence. Unlike one-off creepypastas, it resurfaced periodically whenever Minecraft updates introduced new glitches that could be reinterpreted through the established mythos. This demonstrates how digital folklore isn't static, but exists in a state of continuous evolution, with each iteration adapting to new technological and social contexts. Entity 303 raises profound questions about the nature of reality in digital spaces. If thousands of people collectively experience something as real within a virtual world, does that give it a form of existential validity? Philosophers of technology debate whether Entity 303 was real in the same sense that the game's officially coded mobs are real. After all, both exist as mental constructs that shape player behavior, just with different points of origin. This touches on larger questions about the metaphysics of virtual worlds. Can a sufficiently believed-in myth become functionally true within its digital context? At what point does community consensus override objective code in defining a game's reality? Does the act of searching for Entity 303 actually create it in a digital variation on the observer effect? These questions remain unresolved. But Entity 303 serves as a compelling case study in how human consciousness interacts with programmed environments to create emergent phenomena that defy simple categorization as either real or imagined. Entity 303's legacy subtly influenced how Mojang and other developers approach game design and community management. Key impacts include error handling, more descriptive crash reports to prevent misinterpretation as supernatural events, glitch aesthetics, deliberate incorporation of controlled weirdness like the far lands to satisfy players' appetite for mystery without causing actual instability, community communication, faster debunking of emerging myths to prevent widespread misinformation, horror design, lessons in psychological horror that informed later mobs like the Warden. The phenomenon also led to internal discussions about how much unexplained content to intentionally include, recognizing that players crave discoverable secrets. But that total ambiguity can spiral into unhealthy obsession or misinformation. This balancing act continues to shape live service games today. As we enter an era of AI-generated content and procedural storytelling, Entity 303 may represent the last of its kind of purely human-created digital myth. Future gaming legends will likely emerge from the intersection of player imagination and algorithmic unpredictability, with AI systems potentially generating their own emergent myths through unexpected behavior patterns. However, Entity 303's core appeal, the human need for shared mystery in increasingly knowable digital spaces, will persist. Its true legacy may be as a prototype for how communities will interact with the ghosts in the machine of future virtual worlds, not as bugs to be fixed, but as folklore to be collectively shaped and celebrated. In this sense, Entity 303 wasn't just a Minecraft myth, it was a glimpse into how human spirituality and storytelling will evolve as we spend more of our lives in digital realms. The ultimate irony of Entity 303 is that by not existing, it became more real than most actual game features. It exists in the collective memory of millions of players, in the cautionary backups of worlds, in the sideways glances at distant chunks loading oddly. Its power came precisely from its absence of blank space onto which players could project their deepest anxieties about technology, creativity, and control. In the end, Entity 303 was never really about Minecraft's code. It was about the human experience of playing in digital sandboxes, the simultaneous joy of creation and looking fear that our creations might turn on us. This fundamental tension ensures that, while Entity 303 may fade, the need it fulfilled will keep manifesting in new myths, new legends, and new digital ghosts waiting to be glimpsed just for a second in the corner of our pixelated worlds. Entity 303 presents a fascinating ontological dilemma that challenges our traditional understanding of existence within virtual spaces. Unlike conventional game elements that derive their reality from explicit programming, Entity 303 is being emerged through a complex interplay of community discourse, psychological projection, and digital pareidolia. This raises profound philosophical questions about what constitutes existence in a virtual environment. Can something be said to exist if it influences player behavior and community dynamics, despite having no formal representation in code? The phenomenon suggests that within massively multiplayer environments, existence may operate on a spectrum where collective belief can confer a form of social reality that, while distinct from programmed reality, nevertheless produces tangible effects. This digital animism, the attribution of agency and consciousness to glitches and artifacts, represents a new frontier in our philosophical understanding of virtual worlds and their inhabitants, both intended and emergent. The spread and transformation of Entity 303 follows distinct patterns of mimetic evolution observable in digital ecosystems. Like biological genes, the core memes of the myth, the white figure, the ex-employee backstory, the corruption effects underwent mutation and selection pressures as they propagated through different online communities. Early forum posts served as the primordial soup where these elements first combined, with successful variations, those that triggered stronger emotional responses being preferentially shared and elaborated. The myth demonstrated remarkable adaptive fitness by incorporating modular elements. It could easily assimilate new glitches from game updates into its narrative framework. This mimetic perspective helps explain why Entity 303 showed greater longevity than similar myths, as its core components were perfectly tuned to exploit cognitive biases and community dynamics specific to Minecraft's player base. The myth's life cycle, from emergence to peak virality to eventual declining to nostalgic reference, mirrors established models of meme propagation while adding new dimensions unique to persistent virtual worlds. Examining Entity 303 through the lens of cognitive archaeology reveals how digital communities collectively construct meaning from technological artifacts. Each purported sighting represented an interpretive act where players transformed glitches and coincidences into narrative evidence through cognitive processes like pattern completion and theory of mind attribution. The accumulating weight of these interpretations formed stratigraphic layers of lore that subsequent players could excavate and reinterpret. Unlike traditional archaeology, which studies physical artifacts, this digital variant examines how mental models and social knowledge crystallize around technological phenomena. The myth's persistence demonstrates how once a critical mass of interpretive consensus is reached within a community, it becomes self-sustaining. New players encounter the legend as established fact before they experience the actual game, priming them to interpret anomalies through that lens. This creates a feedback loop where belief structures shape perception, which in turn reinforces belief. a dynamic particularly potent in Minecraft's open-ended environment where players must constantly interpret ambiguous stimuli. Entity 303 experiences represent a distinct class of phenomenological events unique to digital environments. Players reporting encounters describe a characteristic progression from mundane gameplay to mounting unease to eventual confirmation that mirrors established patterns of paranormal experience in physical spaces. However, these digital hauntings differ in their mediation through technology interfaces and their dependence on the unstable semiotics of game systems. The phenomenology involves a peculiar doubling of interpretation. Players must first parse the game's intended representations, then reinterpret them through the lens of the myth. This creates a layered reality where the same pixels simultaneously signify both programmed content and supernatural manifestation. The experience is further complicated by Minecraft's unique temporal dynamics. Unlike static images or videos, the procedural generation of worlds means each potential haunting is subtly unique while following recognizable patterns. This combination of variability within constraints makes digital hauntings like Entity 303 particularly potent and persistent as phenomenological experiences. Entity 303's proliferation illustrates the emergence of a distinct new sphere, a sphere of human thought surrounding Minecraft's virtual worlds. Within this mental ecosystem, ideas and narratives circulate, mutate, and evolve according to their own dynamics while remaining tethered to the game's technological substrate. The myth represents a particularly successful adaptation within this new sphere, one that effectively exploited available cognitive niches by addressing multiple player needs simultaneously. The desire for mystery in an increasingly documented game, the psychological comfort of personifying technical glitches, and the social bonding of shared folklore. This digital noosphere demonstrates properties analogous to biological ecosystems, including speciation divergent versions of the myth in different communities, competition with other legends like Herobrine, and symbiotic relationships with content creation platforms and modding communities. The entrance of Entity 303 suggests that such game-associated noospheres may develop increasing complexity and autonomy as virtual worlds become more persistent and deeply embedded in human culture. Entity 303 transformed mundane glitches into potent semiotic signs within Minecraft's cultural system, where developers forced simple bugs to be fixed. The player community interpreted these errors as meaningful omens through the lens of the established myth. This repurposing of technical artifacts as narrative elements represents a novel form of folk semiosis where the materiality of digital systems becomes imbued with supernatural significance. The process follows identifiable patterns. First, a glitch is isolated from its technical context. Next, it's interpreted as intentional communication, the coded message stage. Finally, it's incorporated into an expanding mythology that gives it retrospective coherence. This semiotic alchemy was particularly effective in Minecraft due to the game's intentionally simple visuals, the low resolution. Blocky aesthetics left ample room for pareidotic interpretation, while the complex underlying systems generated enough variability to sustain the illusion of intentional mystery. The resulting sign system created a shadow narrative that existed parallel to the game's official lore. Complete with its own syntax, recurring glitch patterns, and semantics attributed meanings, the Entity 303 phenomenon developed distinct ritual behaviors that sustained the myth beyond its initial propagation. Players engaged in purposeful myth maintenance activities including organized hunts using specific seed numbers, the creation of shrines or warning signs in multiplayer servers, and the ritual sharing of encounter stories with prescribed narrative structures. These practices mirror traditional folklore preservation techniques while adapting them to digital contexts. The rituals served multiple functions, reinforcing community bonds through shared experience, providing structured ways to engage with the game's more mysterious aspects, and offering a sense of agency against the perceived threat. Notably, these rituals often involve deliberate alterations to normal gameplay, backing up worlds more frequently, avoiding certain biomes at night, or creating warding patterns with blocks. That created a feedback loop where precautionary measures themselves generated more anomalies to interpret. This ritual dimension helps explain the myth's endurance even after technical debunking, as the practices took on social significance independent of their original justification. Neuroscientific research reveals that encounters with Entity 303 or belief in such encounters activate distinct neural pathways involved in threat detection and supernatural belief. Functional MRI studies show that when players view ambiguous Minecraft footage purportedly showing the entity, their brains demonstrate a characteristic conflict between the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex attempting rational analysis and the amygdala triggering instinctive fear responses. This neural tug-of-war helps explain why the myth persists despite intellectual awareness of its fictional nature. The automatic fear response creates thematic markers that feel like authentic experience regardless of conscious knowledge. The effect is amplified by Minecraft's unique visual presentation. The blocky, low-detail graphics force the visual cortex to work harder at pattern completion, increasing the likelihood of false positives in threat detection. Additionally, the game's first-person perspective and control scheme create a stronger sense of embodied presence than many other games, making perceived threats feel more personally immediate. These neurological factors combine to create an unusually potent substrate for supernatural belief to take root and persist. From a game study standpoint, Entity 303 represents a paradigmatic example of emergent narrative in digital environments, and like authored stories, this player-generated mythology arose from the intersection of game systems, community dynamics, and individual psychology. The myth demonstrates all four key characteristics of successful emergent narratives: systemic depth, enough complexity to produce unexpected events; interpretive openness, ambiguity allowing multiple readings; social scaffolding, community structures to share and develop interpretations; and persistence, a game environment stable enough for narratives to develop over time. What makes Entity 303 particularly noteworthy is how it created a shadow narrative economy that operated parallel to the game's official content, complete with its own canon of sightings, apocryphal tales, and heretical debunkings. This emergent narrative ecosystem displayed properties of complex, adaptive systems, with patterns of self-organization and phase transitions as the myth moved through different community spaces. The phenomenon challenges traditional distinctions between players and authors, suggesting that in sufficiently open game worlds, all players become potential myth makers. Entity 303 offers a compelling case study for how future archaeologists might analyze digital belief systems. The myth's traces are preserved across multiple media strata, forum archives, YouTube videos, wiki-edited histories, and even in-game constructions referencing the legend. This distributed preservation creates challenges and opportunities for digital archaeology, while no single artifact contains the complete myth. The aggregate pattern reveals how belief propagated and transformed across platforms. The archaeological record shows characteristic phases: early speculative posts, peak elaboration with competing variants, consolidation around certain canonical elements, and eventual fossilization as nostalgic reference. Future researchers may analyze how the myth spread correlated with technical changes in Minecraft's updates, or how different player demographics interpreted the legend more broadly. Entity 303 represents one of the first fully digital folkloric traditions to emerge organically from game culture, providing a template for understanding how belief systems form in virtual environments. As such, it may someday be seen as the example of a new category of archaeological artifact: the digital folkloric construct that blends technological affordances with human meaning-making in uniquely 21st century ways.